Folks, huge voting took place all across the country. We saw that happening, of course, in many places like Texas. Although Beto O'Rourke did not beat Ted Cruz, he did lift the fortunes of Democrats in suburban counties. Democrats took out 3 Republican members of Congress. Joining us right now is Dr. Gabriel Sanchez, a principal at Latino Decisions and associate professor of political science at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Sanchez, glad to have you here. We saw after 2016, initial exit polling showed this significant number of Latino support for Donald Trump. Latino Decisions went back and crunched the numbers and had an alternative view. Just your immediate assessment of what we saw yesterday. First, let's talk about Florida. I was hearing from folks that Puerto Ricans in significant numbers voted for Rick Scott. They thought that was going to help Bill Nelson and Andrew Gillum. What did you see in those numbers in terms of Latinos in Florida?
Yes, let's give you the overall number. This comes from our election eve data that validated 2,600 voters. So this is the data to go to. Don't go to the exit poll. You've seen our take on that. But overall, 74% of Latinos voted for Democrats in this election cycle. But in Florida, only 59%. So it is fair to say, even though the majority of Latinos in Florida voted with Democrats, I think part of the story in Florida was that, primarily Cuban voters, but also we're seeing some Puerto Rican and other demographics of Latino voters out there still are more divided on their vote choice than you see Latinos across the country in places outside of Florida.
So when you talk about that again for people, because this is the issue that we have here in this country. Look, when we talk about African Americans, we know exactly who we're talking about. It's a small percentage of people who you put in that category who are black immigrants from other countries. When you talk about Latinos, we're talking, especially with Florida, we're talking about Cubans, we're talking about Dominicans, we're talking about Puerto Ricans, we're talking about folks from other countries as well. So it's not as clear cut as it is in places like Texas.
That's right. Thinking about Florida, you also got a wide number of Mexicans out there now. So when we're doing our focus groups and we're doing our polling, you really have to slice up the state and make sure that you're talking to those specific communities, because just like any population, they're diverse, right? And so thinking about all Latinos in Florida is a little misguided. We've got to break it down and look also at generational differences. Even among Cuban voters, we're seeing younger millennial Cubans tend to vote highly Democratic in line with Mexicans and Latinos in other states. So it's really important to capture that variation. But again, 59% of Latinos out there did vote for Democratic candidates.
What did you see in Texas? I saw one initial exit polling, and that's why we came on, Brandon raised the exit polling data. Again, the issue that I have with exit polling, look, it's a quick snapshot. It's a lot different once you start going in, once you start drilling down further, and then beginning to look at high concentration areas, precincts, things along those lines.
Yeah, in Texas, keep in mind, exit poll didn't capture any Latinos in the southern region of the state along the Rio Grande Valley, which is about 90+% in all those precincts Latino. That's about a quarter of all Latinos in the state of Texas that voted are in that region. Exit poll misses them completely. So in Texas, obviously, you don't see Beto O'Rourke do as well as he did without the support of Latino voters. So I think there was clear, and this is partly thinking about 2020, if he was able to almost capture that and lift the votes of a lot of other Democratic candidates across congressional districts, imagine the energy that Latino voters will have in 2020 when they get an opportunity to vote against President Trump. You saw the outcome of that in Texas this time around is going to be even greater in 2020.
I still keep making the point that one of the most fundamental issues, first of all, before I get to that question, what is the number now of eligible but unregistered Latinos in Texas?
It's still a huge number, thinking about percentage-wise.
For the longest it was 2.1 million. Has the number gone down? Is it 1.5, 1.6? Is it 1.8? Any idea what the number is?
Yeah, it's been between 1.5 and 1.6 million. We'll know probably in the next week a little bit more definitive.
So this is what I have been saying is very interesting, because when the 19 black women who are running for judge, who ran for judge in Harris County and all won, and so when I was out with them on Saturday, we were going down the street, and so we were passing. That was a Latino guy who was in his driveway watching all these cars come by with his police escort, and I shouted. I said, "Hey, have you voted?" And he said, "No." I said, "Why not?" He said, "I'm not registered." And I said, "Dude, you can't change anything not being registered." And then he says, "Well, that's not the only way the change was happening in this country." And then I hollered, "Well, what the hell else can you suggest?" And and the thing that I keep saying is that the only way that number is going to shrink is if you literally have folks who put massive resources to move people into those areas where they're living in those areas, seeing folks every day, and literally mobilizing and organizing. It can't be done only within the framework of a political campaign.
That's right. In the data that we collected, we asked folks directly, how many of you tried to mobilize, bring others in your network out to vote? Highest number we've ever seen for Latinos. So I think that's part of the equation, is getting folks out there, not relying on the parties, not relying on the candidates, but doing this more grassroots. It worked this election cycle. But keep in mind, one demographic group that we're talking about, African American and Latino voters, roughly half of all the eligible voting population from those communities are millennials. And even though more of them voted this time around than normal, all of our focus groups on millennials indicate that a lot of those folks will tell you they want social change, but they see social media, going to protests as more impactful in creating social change than voting.
Well,
so I think it's really drilling down to that youth demographic and shaking them up and telling them, man, you're seeing the reality of election outcomes and you're seeing the differences that it makes. You got to get out there, you got to register, and then you got to vote.
Well, look, I'm seeing that with some of these ignorant-ass black men I'm dealing with on social media who are saying that, oh, no, we need to have candidates who are presenting us a black agenda and that's just black. And then when I mention the black people who are actually running, like one brother's like, oh, there are no black politicians in the whole country who are representing black people. I'm going, damn, really? Like not one? And so you have people who believe they can create systematic change, and as if you can create systematic change without politics. That's nuts.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one other point on Texas, I caught y'all's conversation about voter suppression. I was fortunate with my colleague Matt Badetto, also from Latino Decisions, do all the expert witness report on the photo ID case in Texas. Fortunately, we won that, but 1.2 million Latinos and African Americans would have been disenfranchised if that law were to be able to hold up. And there's still a lot of speculation. We heard from a lot of people thinking, well, hey, I thought that photo ID law was in place. I don't have the right ID. That's why I didn't go out to vote. So that's part of voter suppression. Even if it gets defeated in courts, that lingering effect is real. And we hear from a lot of folks, hey, I didn't go because I don't have the right ID, even though the courts threw out the case. So I think voter suppression is a real phenomenon. And to answer the question y'all are batting around, if anybody can name one state that's been in Democratic hands that have pushed for photo ID law, I mean, that's a really important dimension of voter suppression that not a lot of folks talk about.
All right, Dr. Sanchez, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Look forward to having you back on Roland Martin Unfiltered.
My pleasure. Big fan.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.